We've been talking about globalization, and globalization is sometimes considered to be the integration of economies around the world through trade, exports and imports, and financial flows. I want to emphasize that globalization actually for centuries has gone deeper than that because globalization also involves global production systems. In other words, systems that are organized where many, many countries are engaged in the production of a final product. I'll start with one of the key products of our time or key product areas, and that is microelectronics based on semiconductors, commodities like smartphones or computers. And those use the intelligence of microprocessors, for example, often produced by Intel, among other major semiconductor companies. Intel itself has factories around the world, fabrication and assembly factories for semiconductors in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia. That by itself isn't globalization of production systems. That could be really nothing more than international trade. But in fact, microelectronics is a highly intricate ballet of production systems and logistics involving many different phases of an overall production process taking place in dozens of countries around the world. This visual depiction shows the flows of basic design and fabrication of chips and then flowing to places where there are components and subsystems that are also being produced and flowing on to places of final assembly and then flowing from places of final assembly to final consumers. And what you see is a very intricate integration of, especially as is evident here, North America, Western Europe, and predominantly East and Southeast Asia. That's a lot of the world. It is true, as this diagram shows, that for many advanced machine goods, two big parts of the world, Latin America and Africa, are not so tightly integrated into these global production systems. It's one of the reasons why those regions are poor or middle income rather than highly developed, because they are not fully integrated into these global production systems. It's important to see how deeply integrated our economies are to understand that if we were to ever flirt with the idea of reverting to self-sufficiency or autarky or going it alone or a new trade war, we would not only be inconveniencing ourselves with regard to the costs of various goods, we would be essentially breaking the very bonds which make the modern world economy work. These connections are so deep, the production process is so internationalized, that in my view, though every year or two there may be a headline, is globalization over or is globalization in reverse? In fact, globalization continues, and it continues forward because perhaps the main technological driver of globalization is the ever-falling costs of information, the ability to coordinate across national boundaries, the improved logistics that come with that make it possible to manage sophisticated global supply chains. The one major reason historically for a real breakdown of globalization, which occurred with the globalization of the 19th century being stopped and reversed, was war. World War I, then the chaos of the interwar period, then World War II. Yes, that reversed globalization, but at human costs unimaginable. In this sense, I think that this production chain and production system reality is really the defining feature of globalization. This is another depiction more generally, not merely of one industry of electronics, but of the sea lanes more generally. And you see how thick the transport connections are. The major ports are shown here. The major links in trade remain mostly in the northern hemisphere. Again, Latin America and Africa are still predominantly commodity exporters, not so much integrated in global supply chains. They are poorer, their economies are less sophisticated, they're a bit out of the thick integration that has come with the information age, but they're intent on becoming part of it as well. And what is shown here is the major ports of the world. These are ports measured by the number of containers that they handle each year. Those containers that we all know, the 20-foot standardized containers, was also an invention, actually, in the 1950s and 1960s that facilitated globalization. Up until then, ships had goods in holds that were not in standardized containers, and that meant that the time spent in ports, the intermodal time between shipping and transporting goods to rail or to trucking once the ship reached a port, could be a very long process of many, many days. And with the standardization of containers that could fit right in the back of a truck cab, this facilitated globalization. Such a seemingly simple innovation was one of the breakthroughs of the world economy. But what you notice here is, if you look at the amount of throughput of the world's big ports, the magnitudes of the port services in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, in Singapore, these massive modern ports that facilitate a lot of trade between Asia and the rest of the world. It highlights again how in the 21st century globalization, the new wave of globalization that's coming, Asia is very, very likely to be the world's center of gravity. Yes, of course, trading with the United States, trading with Europe, also trading with Latin America and Africa, but with more than half of the world's production and trade taking place within Asia, where more than half of the world's population lives. If you look at this map and you see not too many major ports in Africa and Latin America, you get again a feel that those regions are not as tightly integrated in the northern hemisphere interconnected world economy. Even more than that, obviously there are no major ports in the interior of these continents. But more than that, I can say most production processes are not even within the interiors of countries with big coastlines, such as the United States, where our predominant economic activity takes place along the coasts of the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf of Mexico, rather than in the center, the interior states, which have much lower population densities and much less industrial activity. And if you generalize around the world, landlocked countries, they're not as participating in globalization because transport costs are so high. Places that are large distances from major ports are not, in general, hubs of industrialization and globalization, unless for some reason they're on active waterways or they're specializing in the kinds of services that don't need physical transport but are carried by the internet and electromagnetic waves. An example of that is the city of Bangalore in southern India, a world leader in information technology, not close to the sea routes, but it doesn't matter because Bangalore is specializing in internet-based services rather than in the physical transport of goods that requires proximity to the major trade routes.